Hello and welcome to the big picture. On the eve of the NDA government's Finance Minister Arun Jaitley presenting his maiden general budget tomorrow, the Economic Survey report was presented today. The report presents a mixed bag of challenges and opportunities for the new government. While the low GDP growth below 5% for the second successive year, not seen in 25 years, is a matter of great concern, it also presents a picture of hope of the economy turning around and reaching a growth rate of 7 to 8% in the next 2 years. The report hints at some of the key measures which are required to turn the economy around, including some major reforms on the tax and expenditure front and also in the social sector. What does the Economic Survey portend and what are the challenges before the government, as well as what can we expect from the Finance Minister when he presents his budget tomorrow? We will discuss all this today with an eminent panel of experts. I have with me N.K. Singh, BJP leader and former member Planning Commission and former Finance Secretary, Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, Director General, National Institute of Labour Economic Research, Professor Ravi Srivastava, Centre for Economic Studies and Planning at the JNU, and will be soon joined by Subhomoy Bhattacharya, Executive Editor of the Financial Express. Welcome to all of you. Mr. Singh, is this economic survey, is this a mixed bag, or do you see a lot of grimness in this?
Well, I think that I just want to make, as a preliminary, just three very brief comments. First, I think that, if the past history of economic survey is any guide to the future, the recommendation and the prescriptive value of such a survey is largely in the domain of airing issues for further discussion.
Right.
Because in the past, when the economic survey has suggested certain important policy measures, the budget has not reflected those policy measures. Okay. So there is no binding nature of the recommendations, and this survey should be viewed more as statistical and advisory. And I think that this is one bit of caution. The second important thing which the survey brings out is, I agree with you that the fact that there has been a sub 5% rate of growth in the last 2 years, the fact that the manufacturing sector has been negative 0.4%, that the industry sector as a whole has registered only a 0.9% rate of growth, that fiscal deficit continues to be very high, that this has been a period of jobless growth, are very important challenges in the modalities to be adopted for rekindling the economy and for reigniting the savings investment cycle. I think third is that this does bring out some of the important policy measures which need to be taken in terms of both the expenditure and on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, in terms of a much better issue on rationalizing subsidies, on expenditure management which would improve the outcomes, and in terms of ensuring that this is administered in a manner in which the targeted beneficiaries can receive it in a more efficacious manner. When it comes to revenue, recognizing the sluggishness of revenue buoyancy, given the fact that the growth rate has been very modest, it prescribes changes in the tax regime, some of which are of a legislative nature, others are, of course, in a more administrative nature which the department can undertake. But finally, it does bring out a whole slew of important structural changes which are necessary in various key sectors of the economy, particularly in respect of infrastructure and in the social sector, where some policy decisions are needed to reignite that. It shows that on the ease of doing business and the confidence index, the country has gone down, and to put the country back on the ease of doing business and improve the confidence index, some of these important steps would be useful. I'd particularly like to point out three important measures that they have recommended. They have recommended a new Fiscal Responsibility Act.
Right.
Now, I think the new Fiscal Responsibility Act, which needs more teeth, where parliamentary approval is not ex post, but parliamentary approval is ex ante, will assure markets, assure credit rating agencies, and a time frame for achieving those targets of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. In terms of improving the working of Planning Commission, it has an important recommendation of setting up a Productivity Commission instead of a Planning Commission, which is designed to improve the total factor productivity of the economy, which obviously implies also structural improvements and structural changes in the economy. Third, I think in terms of improving the quality of financial intermediation, It has suggested a new financial code based on the recommendations of the committee, and it has also, of course, suggested that the debt management of the government should be really segregated from the Reserve Bank of India into setting up a separate debt management offices. So there is a whole host of recommendations which are contained. It is yet to be seen how much and in what form really tomorrow's budget reflects these, to put the economy back this year to a 5.4 to a 5.9% rate of growth, which is what the survey projects.
Okay. Santosh, you know, Mr. Singh has virtually given a summary of what the economic survey points out. But one of the major things the survey points out is that if there has to be any improvement, structural constraints which are there. You know, one of the things which it talks about is the kind of structural constraints which were there during the last 5 years, the last 5 years or so, which has resulted in this kind of a fall in GDP growth and things like that. So what kind of these structural constraints are, you know, to improve, are they easier said than done?
Yes, that's true that they are easier said than done, because one of the most important structural constraints is, of course, in the agriculture sector itself. So it would be absolutely critical that what was said in the 11th plan, said again in the 12th five-year plan, that the APMC acts have to be done away with. Those have to be acted upon. Finally, I mean, whatever the political constraints upon carrying that out, if you don't do that, you're not going to be able in the medium run to reduce the vegetable prices, the fruit prices. Simply acting on the order is not. That's one very important structural action that has to happen.
But you know, one of the things which the talk of the first structural factors which are resulted in this kind of a problem, structural constraint, is about difficulty in taking quick decisions on project proposals and things like that. So, you know, what is the economic survey pointing out, giving us some hints about what this government is going to do in the next year, and especially what we can expect from the finance minister tomorrow?
I don't know what I doubt if it's giving us much of a hint about what the finance minister will tell us tomorrow. But I mean, I think Mr. Singh was right in pointing to some of these things that the government could act upon, and in the next year, if it is able to actually act upon all these three things, it would be a great advance in any case. But, you know, the structural constraints that you are asking me about, those remain, and those are hard, and they are hard political economy decisions which have to be taken finally. If the government you know, is not willing to break a few eggs in order to make the omelette, as the saying goes, then the omelette will never happen. So people will continue to wait.
People will continue. Dr. Ravi Srivastava. Yeah. The one of the things which this economic survey talks about, when it talks about, you know, changes which need to, structural constraints which needs to happen, and even I think the finance minister has indicated here in some places today, is that social sector, the subsidy, as far as the subsidies are concerned, there needs to be a major reform. What kind of reforms do you expect?
Well, I mean, the survey itself has suggested a few things. So I don't know whether this government is going to... It has pinpointed the three major sources of subsidy, which is petroleum, food and fertilizers. It has made the general recommendation that there should not be any major misalignment with the markets, because this leads to misallocation of resources which should be economically dearer in this thing. And hence it has advocated, you know, a different kind of subsidy. Well, not subsidy, but basically it has advocated, once again, going back to cash transfers and income transfers rather than food subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, in order to assist the poor. Now, my one big question is really, you know, whatever I have read of the survey so far is that I don't know whether if you were actually in sync with the economic policies of the earlier government, the UPA government, you would possibly take enormous comfort at the fact that the policy prescriptions and the general analysis in this economic survey are very, very, well, basically they are in some sense a very strong continuation and an endorsement of what the UPA was doing.
Was doing or was intending to do.
Or intending to do almost on all fronts, whether it is, fiscal consolidation, the direct tax code bill, the GST, the regulation of the financial sector, and so on, and whether food subsidies, petroleum subsidies, and so on. So one really gets this enormous, as I said, if you were in sync with those policies, you would take a great deal of comfort with it. But if you were really, critical of what was happening or of the analysis on which those assumptions of growth and development were based, then I don't think you can take much comfort from what is contained in this economic survey. I'll just make two very brief points. One, it is on there are two parts, which of course interlinked. One is analysis of the year gone by, and then the prescriptions. On the analysis, I must say this is reasonably realistic. The way it analyzes international and internal constraints, I would say, I would give it 6 out of 10. There are important areas of omission, but somewhere along the line, on prescriptions, it's an enormous thing in continuity. So, it depends on where you stand with respect to both these issues. No, that's very interesting. And what
before I go to Subhomoy, I actually want to go back to Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh, would you agree with Professor Srivastava on that? That there seems to be a continuity between what UPA government did or intended to do and what the NDA government wants to do, as far as prescriptions are concerned?
Well, let me put it this way to you that, this is one of the great features of the Indian economic strategy, which has been internationally applauded. Dr. Manmohan Singh began important economic reforms in 1991. I was in the Ministry of Finance at that time. And when the NDA government came, it continued with the policies which had been at that time, during P.V. Narasimha Rao's time, articulated by Dr. Manmohan Singh at some length. And I think that the policies which the NDA government put in place, like for instance enormous changes in the infrastructure sector, like on the telecom sector, like the road sector, the National Highway Program, a lot of this was taken in and implemented by the UPA-1 government. So I think one of the features of the Indian economic strategy has been by and large a degree of continuity, because I think that these are the policies which really need to be thing. But the big difference is, it is less important to know what is important. It is more important to be able to do it. Fiscal consolidation roadmap is something that was first articulated by the first finance minister of the UPA government. It was somewhat altered. Mr. Chidambaram put a pause button based on the Kelkar committee report. The revised Kelkar committee recommendations in the path of fiscal consolidation was then taken on board, but not implemented. The thing is that the prescriptions do not vary, but the ability and the will to implement them is what should be the critical guiding factor in assessing how well this government performs in reviving the growth momentum.
Okay, that's interesting. Subhomoy, so, we are, even Mr. Singh also agrees that there seems to be certain continuity with what the UPA did and what the NDA is intending to do or planning to do. But as he says, that implementation is the key. But the factor is, you think that the NDA government would like to continue most of the policies of the, or is this just because, they have just taken over, so we don't see much change? But do you expect major, departures in the way the NDA government would look at the economy and try to fix it when you compare it to the UPA?
Yep. If you look at, even in terms of just the allocation of resources, that itself, the economic survey points out that the Planning Commission will actually not be the place from where economic management will be decided on.
Right.
And that itself sets a very major difference in the way who and what sort of number of people decide on how to allocate resources. So, that itself, I think, is a very fundamental change, because that changes the number of people who are getting into any particular set of decisions. So I think there are major changes.
There are hints to, so you would say that there are hints to some major changes?
Absolutely. In fact, if you look at it in terms of the economic surveys and our past surveys, some of the past surveys have been extremely brilliant ones, like the one Dr. Rajan prepared. These ones have actually laid the groundwork for looking at specific sectors in focus. You know, the economic survey, because it's a smorgasbord of everything,
Right.
it talks about everything. So if you want, you can always find out continuation with, in fact, what we have been doing even since 1950s. But if we look at in terms of what is the issue that is being flagged most majorly in economic surveys, that's the way to read it. And that is the one to judge whether the government of the day is able to take forward that particular policy prescription. So Rajan, for instance, talked about labor and how to use skilled labor, his push on Apprentice Act. It really had been flagged well in previous budgets, in previous surveys. Ditto this time, I would think that the one that talking about is agriculture and food economy. And that is what pervades through the budget, through the economic survey. Now, if the government is able to take it on, well and good. But the point is that that is something that is the main story that is coming out of the survey, that there is something that we need to work on the food economy, and what are the ways in which it can be done. The other associated issue is, of course, the manufacturing sector.
Right.
These are the two broad areas which it is, coming back to repeatedly.
Right. In fact, Santosh, my question is this. Agriculture, Subhomoy was mentioning agriculture, you also mentioned agriculture. The fact of the matter is that agriculture growth has taken place in the last one. It has improved, actually. So would you say that this government actually, all the criticism that the UPA faced on several fronts, when you look at the numbers now, actually there has been a better agricultural growth rate in the last one. So this government, the new government, is actually better poised to handle some of the problems which it faced than what we thought during the campaign or before that the UPA government has completely, policy paralysis and things like that. Does the survey report indicate actually a better climate than what we thought?
Well, certainly we know that we are riding the wave of the 3.4% per annum agricultural growth rate that we saw over the 12th, 11th plan period.
4.7%.
Most last you are right.
2013-14.
I'm talking about
2012-13 it was 1.4%, and now
on a lower base.
13-14, 4.7%.
That's right.
It seems to have gone up by 3%.
Well, you see, the point is that we need to take this even higher, because historically we are now hitting historically high rates of agricultural growth rates.
The highest apparently was in 2010-11 when it touched 8.6%.
No, I'm talking about a 60-year history of our agriculture, and these are among the highest rates that we've ever experienced in the history of our country, and therefore it's a good foundation. But the harder decisions are now to be taken. I mean, if you don't bury the APMC acts in all the states, I mean, this would require real political will. A real political will. And also, you have to contain the MSPs. You cannot continue to raise MSPs in the way that you have, because it has been fueling inflation. And thirdly, you have to reduce the stocks. The stocks are too high. If you don't reduce the stocks and release that into the market, you will not be able to contain at least cereal inflation. So while many other forces are raising food inflation, can we at least act finally, which the UPA failed to do, on actually releasing the grain stock? But more importantly, of course, there are a whole slew of actions that, in a sense, the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, is very well, equipped to actually implement, because he is the man who brought extremely high growth rates to agriculture in Gujarat.
Right.
And if we were to replicate many of those models, whether it is the provision of seeds or the provision of roads, and the water associations and so on and so forth. There's so much that was done in agriculture in Gujarat, which if was replicated across the country, I think if, for instance, let me just make one other point if you don't mind. If our planning commission becomes a clearinghouse of this kind of information, which actually institutionalizes state-level success stories and helps to replicate the knowledge that is already in existence in the country, the Planning Commission would be serving a hugely important role.
Ravi.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I would disagree with some of these propositions. What Santosh has just said, the three arguments these three arguments are underscored in the economic survey. But I'm afraid both on these two sectors, the crucial sectors, that is manufacturing and agriculture, the economic survey's analysis just doesn't go far enough. You see, the years of the boom, 2002-3 to 2007-8, we experienced rapid growth in manufacturing and exports. But this was capital-intensive exports, capital-intensive manufacturing. Now, the normal analysis of this thing is that it's all linked to labor reforms. You know, you liberalize labor and you get the story. There is a lot more to this. This has to do with the pattern of demand. This has to do with the cost of capital and so on. Again, on agriculture, the APMC Act is a very convenient whipping boy. You know, Bihar has done it. Bihar has abolished the APMC Act. Some other states have followed suit, and one needs to do, you know, look at it very carefully and see whether the states that have abolished the act completely, not just liberalized, what is the extent of gain from it. The point here is that in India, with 87 to 88% farmers being marginal and small farmers, the kind of support institutions that you need for marketing, for credit, for agricultural extension and so on, for irrigation support, that have to be developed. And as Santosh pointed out towards the end, some of the states have managed to do it. And in general, since 2002-3, there was some revival of investment in public investment in agriculture. It started in the early NDA government, was taken and intensified. That the final point is with respect to the Planning Commission. That has again become a kind of this thing. The fact is that the IMF and the World Bank, you know, for a very long time have been focusing on making the finance ministries in developing countries the sole repository of policy. You know, there's a concentration. In India, the fact that you had a think tank, a very weak think tank, which needs to be, as Santosh pointed out, a lot needs to be done with it in terms of revamping it, giving it new goals. But the fact that you had something of this kind meant that institutions, international institutions, need to continuously interact with it. And this was the finance ministry can never fulfill that requirement.
No, that is in fact we have had a discussion. I want to get Mr. N.K. Singh on this. N.K. Singh, a former member of the Planning Commission. Mr. Singh, how do you react to this proposal that, you know, Planning Commission will be revamped? It will be, you know, it will not anymore. Maybe it may not even be called Planning Commission anymore. How do you look at this idea?
Well, let me first briefly, with your permission, make one broad observation that I think that one of the panelists did mention that the survey brings out the fact that the previous government has left behind a fair record on the economic front. This is far from true, because whereas there has been a spurt in terms of agriculture, the contribution of agriculture to GDP has shrunk also rather significantly during this period. But I think on the other things, in terms of a sub 5% rate of growth, in terms of a decade of jobless growth, in terms of manufacturing sector having been brought down to zero, in terms of the fact that the infrastructure and the quality of infrastructure has remained abysmally poor, in terms of the fact that the increasing uncompetitiveness of the Indian economy has led to large migration of capital from outside India and our inability to attract foreign investment. I mean, it has left behind a state in which it's a very dubious period, and I think that that makes the task of the Modi government doubly more difficult, and Mr. Jaitley grappling with some of these issues, trying to balance some of these things in terms of the issues of growth with issues of fiscal consolidation, the short term and the medium term. These are challenges, I think, that which the survey does bring out of a rather abysmal record on which the new government has to begin to act. Now, on the Planning Commission.
Yes.
On the Planning Commission, you know, I had the privilege of being a member of the Planning Commission during the period of Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee. I do believe that the Planning Commission in its present form certainly requires a very major surgery. It has no statutory obligations. It has been created by a very ordinary gazette notification by the Cabinet Secretariat at that particular point in time. And over a period of time, I think its functions began to get more and more numerous and more complex. I feel that there is a great utility of the Planning Commission as an important think tank. Right. And I totally agree with one of the panelists that the functions of the Treasury cannot be coterminous with the function of an independent think tank.
Right.
Because you do require a somewhat adversarial body, adversarial to the treasury functions, which is focused on development.
Right.
And I think that the Planning Commission needs to be therefore restructured. But I think the functions which it was performing in terms of this resource allocation was making plan, non-plan, revenue, capital, was fragmenting the responsibility of an integrated expenditure management. And I'm glad that that system has been put to end. I think as far as states are concerned, really having 65 centrally sponsored schemes instead of the resources going directly to the states, and instead of this function being performed by the Finance Commission, abrogating these functions was really frankly a violation of the spirit of the federal structure which is contained in our constitution.
Okay.
So finally, I would say that the Planning Commission needs a fundamental restructuring, converted into a think tank. Even the Chinese who have a planning commission have now re-christened their commission as a commission for economic reforms and planning, and that's something and a direction in which we need to think and move.
Okay, Subhomoy, one of the major issues which probably we will be waiting to when the finance minister presents his budget tomorrow is about natural resources. There's been huge controversy in this country, scams after scams on this. Do you see any hints at the kind of policies which we should expect on allocations of natural resources?
Girish, it says there clearly that the Eco-Survey says that they do not want auctions to be the only way to give out natural resource. Instead, they say it should be a revenue sharing program,
right,
which should be explored.
Right.
And on gas, it doesn't mention gas, but it says those resources which are in competition with those abroad, there should be a import parity price. So as far as the survey is concerned, it's very clear which side it is looking towards. So I don't think there's any room for ambiguity there. Broadly, since we're talking a lot of, I don't think Planning Commission is particularly a thing to talk about in Eco-Survey, because that's something that can be discussed also.
We will discuss, because we had a discussion earlier also on that. Ravi, Srivastava, social sector, do you see major changes taking place? Because there is a clear hint here in the economic survey about major changes as far as social sector is concerned. As some of the programs of the social sector, NREGA, health scheme and things like that, there is a prescription in the economic survey. Do you think the government will be going
ahead? The government, you see, the 240,000 crores or so, which at the moment is within quotes considered to be a subsidy. I don't know whether all of it is a subsidy in that sense, and there is a lot more pruning which can be done.
2.5 lakh crores.
Yeah. So that certainly is, this government has said that it would like to streamline, undertake reforms. But I don't see how that is different from what the UPA government, and because what I see in the last 45 days or 40 odd days or whatever is that there have been conflicting, statements that have emerged. Let's say the DBT. Between the NPR and the DBT. We saw this debate over, almost 2 years. We see this debate re-emerging over NREGA. We see the Prime Minister on 27th of June saying that NREGA will have to be used, needs to be strengthened in the drought conditions. We see a letter from the Chief Minister of Rajasthan saying, well, why not convert it into a scheme? So also the National Food Security Act, so you extended it.
So what you're basically
saying is still out there.
Yes. And what you're saying is that there's not much difference between what the UPA has done and the NDA.
I think the intention of this government is there, but we'll have to wait and watch which way these reforms will go.
Very quick last words to you, Santosh. Subsidy reforms, tax reforms. There are a lot of reforms which have been propagated by this. Do you see any of them taking off in the near future? And would you expect that to be made clear in the finance minister's budget speech tomorrow?
Well, I hope so. Because frankly, a lot of our subsidies are untargeted subsidies, and those have to be fixed. Otherwise, we can keep talking about fiscal consolidation until the cows come home, and that fiscal consolidation will not happen. So even if you got a new FRBM, which is what the economic survey is suggesting, you will not in fact actually get the fiscal consolidation. So the government has no choice but to begin to bite the bullet in respect particularly of fertilizer subsidy, because the previous government did almost nothing about that.
Okay.
And it has to completely now roll back the stimuli that had been given, so that you get finally tax revenue to GDP up, because tax revenue to GDP has been going down.
Okay. I think on that note we need to end. The fact is that tomorrow we'll wait and see what the finance minister, as Mr. Singh very right at the beginning pointed out, that these economic survey reports are not necessarily followed by the government, followed by the finance minister in his budget, but we'll wait and see how many of the prescriptions which the economic survey has made will be adopted by the finance minister tomorrow. Thanks to all my guests, Mr. N.K. Singh, Subhomoy Bhattacharya, Professor Ravi, Srivastava and Dr. Santosh, Mehrotra. Please keep watching. We'll have a full day's discussion tomorrow on the budget. Thanks to all my guests.